Let me ask you something uncomfortable. When was the last time you stopped trying? Not because you didn't want love, but because wanting it started to hurt too much. Right now, millions of men aren't angry about dating. They're not even hopeful. They're just done. Not because they failed, but because the system made them feel invisible. And if that quiet exhaustion sounds familiar, you need to hear what comes next. More men are single today than at any point in modern history. And what's strange isn't just the number. It's that a lot of men aren't even trying anymore. Not because you hate women, not because you're lazy, but because somewhere along the way, dating stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like humiliation. I know this feeling. It's the feeling of sending a message and hearing nothing back, of getting matches that disappear, of watching people say, just be confident, while every experience quietly teaches you that confidence isn't rewarded either. Think about it this way. Humans are wired to repeat behaviors that bring reward. When effort leads to connection, we lean in. When effort leads to silence, rejection, or being ignored, the brain doesn't say, try harder. It says, stop touching the stove. I remember reading a psychology paper that explained how repeated social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. Your nervous system doesn't know the difference between being burned and being ignored. It just learns avoidance. So when you slowly stop trying, that's not weakness, that's conditioning. And what makes it worse is that no one really talks about this with empathy. You're either told, man up, or blamed for not being good enough, or compared to some ideal version of a man that barely exists offline. So you start feeling invisible, replaceable, quietly exhausted, and you don't announce that you're giving up on dating. You just stop opening the apps. You stop initiating conversations. You stop hoping. Here's the real question I want you to sit with. What happens to a generation of men when effort no longer feels rewarded, and silence becomes the loudest response they hear? If that question hits a little too close to home, this isn't a video to judge you. It's a video to finally understand what's really happening to you. Let me zoom out for a second, because this isn't just your story, it's a pattern. Over 60% of men under 30 are single right now, not casually dating, not figuring things out, actually alone. When I first read that number, what struck me wasn't how high it was how quiet the response has been. No marches, no outrage, just silence. Think about the environment you're trying to date in. Most dating apps are almost 3/4 men, which means you're not being rejected in a normal social setting. You're being filtered by an algorithm in a marketplace where attention is scarce and unevenly distributed. And when attention concentrates, rejection multiplies. So, rejection stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like a background noise. Messages unanswered, matches that vanish, conversations that never start. What makes this especially brutal is the lack of feedback. In real life, at least you get context, body language, tone, a signal. Here, you just get nothing. The human brain hates ambiguity more than failure. When you don't know why something isn't working, you assume it's you. So effort begins to feel irrational, like pouring energy into a system that gives nothing back. And here's the part no one sees. Men aren't loudly quitting dating, they're quietly withdrawing, emotionally first, then socially, then romantically. They stop hoping, not because they don't want connection, but because wanting starts to feel unsafe. And once you see this clearly, something shifts. This isn't a personal collapse. It's a structural pressure, understanding that doesn't fix everything. But it does something powerful. It replaces confusion with clarity. I want to take you somewhere older than dating apps, older than social media, older than the idea that your worth can be measured. There's a Zen teaching that says, desire without belonging creates suffering. I didn't understand that the first time I heard it, but think about it this way. Wanting connection is human, but when your sense of who you are depends on being chosen, every no doesn't just hurt. There's a parable about a monk who spent his days trying to impress people in the village. He adjusted how he spoke, how he walked, how he showed up, and the more approval he chased, the more restless he became. Another monk did the opposite. He anchored himself in purpose, service, routine, inner discipline. And without trying to be impressive, people felt drawn to him, not because he was better, but because he was grounded. This is the part that matters for you. When your identity is outsourced to validation, rejection feels like annihilation. It's not just, she didn't choose me. It becomes, there must be something wrong with me. Dating didn't just become harder. It became identity threatening. Every swipe, every silence, every comparison asks the same dangerous question. Am I enough? And ancient wisdom would say this gently, not judgmentally. You were never meant to answer that question through other people. The suffering you're feeling isn't proof of failure. It's proof of attachment to something that was never stable. You're not broken. You're just trying to build self-worth on ground that keeps moving. Once you see that, the pain doesn't disappear overnight, but it stops being personal. And that's the beginning of peace. I want to talk to you now as a scientist would, not cold, not clinical, but precise. Because once you understand what's happening in your brain, the shame starts to loosen its grip. There's a concept in psychology called attachment theory. At its core, it explains how humans respond to connection and rejection. When connection feels safe, you move toward it. When rejection becomes repeated and unpredictable, the brain adapts, not by hoping more, but by caring less. I remember reading a study that showed how people exposed to chronic social rejection often shift into what's called avoidant coping. The internal dialogue quietly changes from, I want connection to I don't need this anyway. That shift isn't arrogance, it's protection. Your nervous system learns that wanting hurts, so it numbs the wanting. Now, here's where things get complicated. The brain still craves intimacy, touch, novelty, release, so it looks for substitutes. Porn fits perfectly into this gap. It offers dopamine without risk, no rejection, no judgment, no uncertainty. From a neurological standpoint, it's efficient. From a human standpoint, it's empty. You're not choosing porn because you're weak. You're choosing it because it doesn't wound you. And during the pandemic, this pattern didn't start. It accelerated. Isolation taught millions of people that digital comfort is safer than real connection. That screens don't leave. People do. But there's another layer that doesn't get talked about enough. Digital burnout. You scroll through social media and see extremes, perfect bodies, perfect lifestyles, perfect confidence. Then you hear alpha male content telling you that unless you're dominant, rich, and constantly desired, you failed as a man. Think about what that does psychologically. Your baseline shifts. Normal becomes invisible. Average becomes unacceptable. I remember a psychologist explaining that constant upward comparison creates chronic inadequacy. Not the kind that motivates, the kind that exhausts. So you stop trying to improve and start trying to escape. And slowly, something dangerous happens. Loneliness without language turns into numbness. You don't feel sad all the time. You feel flat, disconnected, like you're watching life instead of participating in it. If that sounds familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. There is nothing wrong with you. What you're experiencing is a predictable response to prolonged rejection, overstimulation, and unrealistic standards. This isn't a moral failure. It's a nervous system adaptation. Understanding that doesn't magically fix everything, but it changes the story you tell yourself. And the story you tell yourself determines whether you stay stuck or start healing. I want to say something carefully, because this is where the shift begins. Giving up on dating isn't weakness. It's a response, a nervous system saying, I've taken enough hits. There's compassion in that. But staying there, quietly, staying numb, disconnected, telling yourself you don't want what you still crave. That's how loneliness stops being a season and starts becoming a lifestyle. I remember reading a long-term study on social withdrawal. What surprised me wasn't that people got lonelier over time. It was that their identity changed. They didn't say, I'm alone right now. They started saying, I'm just not someone relationships work for. That's the danger zone. Because once loneliness becomes part of how you see yourself, effort feels pointless before it even begins. Think about it this way. Avoidance feels like control in the short term. You can't be rejected if you don't reach out. You can't be disappointed if you don't hope. But psychologically, avoidance doesn't heal pain, and frozen pain doesn't disappear. It just becomes the background temperature of your life. This is the moment where agency quietly returns. Not by forcing optimism, not by pretending dating is easy, but by recognizing that protection has a cost. You don't need to jump back into dating tomorrow. You don't need to download every app again. You don't need to perform confidence. You just need to stop confusing withdrawal with peace. Peace feels open. Withdrawal feels closed. And if you're honest, you know the difference. This isn't about blaming you for pulling back. It's about gently asking whether the strategy that once protected you is now keeping you stuck. That question alone is enough to change what comes next. Let's talk about what actually helps. Not in theory, not in a highlight reel way, but in a way your nervous system can handle. The first shift is this. You have to detach your self-worth from outcomes. Rejection in dating is not a verdict. It's feedback filtered through preference, timing, mood, and algorithmic noise. Think about it this way. If you walk into a room and tell the truth about who you are, and someone isn't interested, the failure isn't you. The failure would be pretending next time just to be chosen. So the goal changes. You stop asking, did she pick me? And start asking, did I show up honestly, clearly, and with self-respect? I remember reading a study on performance anxiety that showed people recover faster when success is defined by effort rather than outcome. Your brain relaxes when it knows it did its job. That's step one. Step 2 is rebuilding your masculine identity outside of dating. This matters more than most people realize. Attraction grows when life feels full. And fullness comes from places that don't swipe back. Purpose, physical strength, and energy, brotherhood, skill mastery. When you're progressing in something that demands effort and rewards consistency, your nervous system stabilizes. You're no longer asking dating to give you a sense of worth. It was never designed to provide. Dating becomes an addition, not a rescue mission. And finally, step 3, choose depth over algorithms. Dating apps compress human beings into snapshots and statistics. They reward novelty, not familiarity, but psychological attraction grows through repeated exposure and shared context. I remember reading about the mere exposure effect. The more we encounter someone in a meaningful environment, the more safety and attraction can grow. So prioritize spaces where people see you more than once. Communities, classes, gyms, volunteer work, creative circles, places where your presence accumulates instead of resets. Real attraction is slow. It's subtle. It's built through small moments of recognition and trust. And here's the quiet hope I want to leave you with. You don't need to become someone else to be chosen. You need to become anchored enough that being chosen no longer defines you. That's not motivational fluff. That's psychological freedom. And from that place, connection stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling possible again. I want to end by reframing the story you've been telling yourself. Men aren't giving up on love. You haven't stopped wanting connection, warmth, or to be chosen for who you are. What many men are actually giving up on is a system that made them feel disposable. A system that turned vulnerability into a performance and effort into a statistic. Think about how different that feels. One says, I'm unlovable. The other says, this environment wasn't built for human nervous systems. That distinction matters because it decides whether you turn inward with shame or outward with clarity. I remember reading a long-term study on social trust. It showed that people don't withdraw because they stop caring. They withdraw because caring stops feeling safe. That's what's happened to a lot of men. Not bitterness, just exhaustion. And this is where empathy has to widen. Empathy for men who feel invisible and don't know how to talk about it without being dismissed. Empathy for women navigating their own pressures, risks, and expectations in modern dating. Empathy for a culture that replaced community with convenience and then wondered why everyone feels alone. This isn't about taking sides. It's about remembering that connection was never meant to be optimized like a product. Real relationships grow slowly, through friction, through missteps, through staying when it would be easier to disappear. And that brings me to you. If you're still listening, it means some part of you hasn't shut down. Some part of you still believes that connection is possible, even if it feels distant right now. Hold on to that part, not by forcing yourself back into the same systems that hurt you, but by becoming someone who doesn't vanish when dating gets hard. Someone who stays present with discomfort instead of numbing it. Someone who builds a life sturdy enough that rejection doesn't collapse it. Someone who can want love without needing it to prove their worth. That's the real work. And it's quiet. And it's slow. But it's how intimacy becomes safe again. The goal isn't to win dating. It never was. The goal is to become someone who doesn't disappear when dating gets hard. And if you can do that, you haven't lost anything. You've begun to return to yourself.